Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we are going to be discussing a fairly pertinent issue, and it is an issue regarding questions regarding the history of Benin. And some of these questions have been raised by Search for Uhuru, and some of these questions have been raised by groups who identify themselves in the West as Hebrews. And so we're going to be looking at some of that discussion and trying to parse some of Benin's history to get a better understanding of that history and the history of the kingdoms that came before Benin. But before we get started, let's send a great thank you out there to all of the people who are doing all of this great research as they are trying to get a better understanding of the ancestral heritage of those who are in the West, whether we're talking about in the continental United States or in the islands in terms of the Caribbean. And also, when you get a better understanding of one group of people, it's going to give you a better understanding of the totality of people. And so it's not in vain. So when you are doing some research and you find something out about a group of people, it could be people in India, it could be people in Afghanistan, it doesn't matter. Once you have a piece of history about one group, it's going to impact the understanding of the history of pretty much all of the other groups on the planet if people are careful in terms of parsing that information. And so again, thank you to all of you researchers, from Dynas to Dane Calloway, and to a whole host of other researchers that are out there. Now, before we go on, I want to point out this issue of confirmation bias that creeps into research. And so what happens sometimes is when individuals are doing research, there is a tendency to look for what a person expects to see. And sometimes there's a tendency to dismiss things that don't comport with what someone thinks they should be seeing. And so oftentimes also when researchers present their new findings to the world, sometimes people are prone to reject the findings if those findings are not consistent with what the individual or the group already believe. So whatever their preconceived notions are, if the new research doesn't fall in line with that, the discoveries, if they don't fall in line with what people already believe, then there's a tendency to automatically reject a lot of things. And I have seen that happen. You've seen that happen a lot with the different theories about ancestral heritage when it comes to brown folks in America and in the Americas, just that overall history. And sometimes people tend to forget that history is written by the winners. And so when you're uncovering new knowledge, sometimes people are just very, very resistant because it just does not fit with that paradigm that they have. And so it creates a lot of cognitive dissonance. And that happens a great deal, and particularly with research related to indigenous populations. And so the American Indians, the identity of the American Indians, people have a very difficult time with entertaining any vantage point that doesn't really square with what they've been historically told. And so the same thing is the case with what we are going to be discussing today. And so you can buckle up and get out your pads and pencils if you want to, and we're going to dig into this. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the names of the kingdom, the main kingdom that came before what Benin is today and what it was when it was Dahomey and also Danhomey. And so we're going to address that particular kingdom that was before both of those, before it was taken over. And that kingdom, as with other shell game kingdoms and place names. That kingdom has many names. It's the same kingdom, but it has gone by many names. And the only thing that stays consistent pretty much is the end of the names for the kingdom. And so some of you have heard the names of this kingdom before, and it has gone by a variety of iterations, as you can see on the screen. So we've got Whydah and Whydah and Juda and Juda and Juda and Whydah and Juda. So it has gone by a number of iterations. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at these iterations to get a sense of the identity of this kingdom, because there is some discrepancy. And one of the things that happened when there was some research going on in Benin, we got to see some of that. One of the things that happens is when you ask individuals about the history of a place, it's important to ask individuals who are versed in that history of the place, the totality of the history, and on a deeper level than just a tourist level. And let's go ahead and tackle this issue related to the middle words there, which are Judah and Judah, and also Yehuda and Yehuda. And those come from scripture. For those of you who learn better through scriptural references, then you're going to particularly appreciate this particular session that we're going to be having here. Okay, so one of the things that has happened is there has been a lot of difficulty with people embracing the possibility that this kingdom could actually be this kingdom that is referenced in biblical literature, or this kingdom that is referenced in terms of ancestry. So it's stepping outside of the religious piece and simply looking at ancestry. And so there is some difficulty with contemplating the possibility that this Judah is the ancestral Judah that is indicated in biblical literature. And as we've talked about in the videos related to Nordicism and also melanism, so that focus on stereotypical whiteness and stereotypical blackness, there is a difficulty for many people, this idea of entertaining the possibility that the ancestral people known as Judah or Yehuda, that they would be, or Huda, that they would actually be in Africa. But again, if you recall the video on the different names of Africa, you can imagine that anyone and everyone could be in Africa. Okay, so we're going to look at this piece by piece, and we're going to translate some of these words and see if we can get a better understanding of who this kingdom was and who this king is who is on the screen. And so there are three kings actually. And so you have the king of Judah, and then you have the kings of Homey, also Homey. And before we go any further, let's stop for a moment, and we're going to look at some of the literature that's available through the Whydah museum that is in Benin. And it's a very interesting museum. You can see some of the information online. And what they are saying in Benin in terms of this museum is that in March of 1727, King Agaja of Dahomey mounted an attack on Whydah, and this is the Yoruba spelling of Judah and Whydah. Okay, so again, the shell game with this name. And so they saw an opportunity to attack Whydah. And the king at the time, who there's also a shell game with the king's name, is King Hafan. King Hafan's name is also spelled King Hufan with a U or an A. And so You can see it's just gets very confusing when you start looking at all these different spellings of these names. But this isn't just for Africa. This happens with place names in America, all over the place, okay? And so what basically is being told in terms of the oral history is that the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Juda, they failed to mount a guard at the river, and they were conquered. Now, it's important to note that prior to this conquering, that they were conquered prior to this by the Akwamu, which are an Akan group, that kingdom. And so there's a little bit of confusion about who was being attacked exactly. However, moving right along, what happened was the kingdom of Dahomey slaughtered 5,000 of the kingdom of Judah. And then the numbers vary. It says anywhere from 11 to 10,000 individuals were imprisoned and then sold into slavery. Now, depending upon the histories that you might read, sometimes the battle went on for a long time with the Oyo kingdom interceding and assisting the kingdom of Judah, and then at some point in time assisting the kingdom of Dahomey. And so there was a lot of stuff going on over there at this time. And it's also important to note that unlike other wars that were going on between the nation states known as tribes, the kingdoms, the European kingdoms were also involved very specifically in this particular war with France and England and Portugal being some of the main players. And it's also important to note that the 5,000 that were slaughtered, they were slaughtered as a part of a religious sacrifice. So it wasn't simply as a part of the war. It was a part of a religious ceremony that the kingdom of Dahomey performed. And here we have a brief summary regarding Hefan. It's very brief. There is more literature out there about him. But again, the literature, you will have to put the literature together so that you can note inconsistencies and consistencies in terms of the history. And so Hefan was born, per this record, from 1695 and then was deceased at 1727. There is some confusion and inconsistency about that ending date also. He came to the throne as a child. He came to the throne after what was one of those wars of succession, similar to the wars of succession that were going on in Europe. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And so when his father died, there were 3 princes, and they were babies. And so there was an argument, of course, in a war of succession. There was an argument about who was going to take the throne, and there was an attempt to take the throne from the 3 boys, the 3 princes. And this is where Europe got involved. And so those same kings and kingdoms in Europe that were going through wars of succession got involved in this whole process and sought to force the issue of making sure that the child heirs were the ones that were considered to take over the throne. And that is basically what happened. And so Hefan took over the throne. However, he was a baby at the time. And by baby, that's meant as a child. Okay, so Hefan was the king of Whydah, Juda, all of those. And so this was a kingdom in West Africa, and basically it is the kingdom on which Benin currently sits. And so Benin is actually sitting on the kingdom of Whydah, the kingdom of Judah. And so what that means is when you hear the history of Whydah, when you hear the history of Judah, it will be told through the eyes of Benin, because Homey was the winner, if you will, of that war. And so the history is always going to be told through the eyes and the voice of the victor. And so what you have here is the kingdom was conquered first, as mentioned before, by the Akan. And then it was conquered by Homey. And so there's a little bit of discrepancy about what was going on in between all of this. And there is some suggestion that the entire history has been rewritten. And of course that makes sense. So there's been what basically looks like an identity theft. So you have an entire kingdom that takes the identity of another kingdom and then engages in this sort of conflating of identities, so that the older identity is subsumed in the new identity, and then things are projected onto the old kingdom's identity that may be inconsistent with the reality of that prior kingdom. And so the one thing that still holds is, all of these different spellings for Whydah, and some of them are French spellings. There's a Dutch spelling, and then you have the Yoruba spelling and the way that it's pronounced. And so that is very important, because when you're looking at this situation with this kingdom, you have the Akan, you have what is now currently Nigeria, and Benin, all involved in the history of this particular kingdom. And there is some suggestion that Hefan, the child king, was no ordinary king in the eyes of the European monarchs who were also going through this war of succession. And so in particular, the Jacobites, or the Jacobites, Jacobi, depending on how you're pronouncing that, the Stuart family. Based upon the Stuart family and the kingdom in France and the kingdom in Portugal, there was something particularly unique about their understanding of Hefan. And so those kingdoms together presented Hefan with his crown, with his scepter, and with his actual throne. And the picture of the young person there with the wig and the gun and his little royal robe there, that is Hefan. And to the right, you see the monarchs of Europe who were around during that time, either the time of Hefan's reign or the closer to the time of his father's reign, around that time. So we're talking about the 1600s and very early 1700s. And as we move through this, we're going to get a better idea of who they thought Hefan was and what they thought the kingdom was that he was the sovereign for. And here we have Hefan, and pictured with two of the sovereigns of Dahomey after Whydah, after Judah was conquered. And so to be clear, you're talking about two completely different kingdoms, even though they are in the same geographic space. And so you have simply a kingdom that was taken over, and once it was taken over, you have these other sovereigns who are over that geographic space, even though the kingdom itself has been dispersed. And here we have the original king of Judah. This is not the king of Homey. This is also not the king of Benin. And so Benin was another kingdom, Ghana, another kingdom. And part of the problem that people have with understanding this is that you actually have countries now that have the names of former kingdoms, and those countries are not in any way related many times to the kingdoms that they have adopted the name from. So they have names of kingdoms that are inconsistent with who they are historically. And so now in Benin, you have a little, sliver of land that's known as Whydah. And so there's some confusion because people tend to think that Whydah is the same as an entire kingdom. And so Benin is actually sitting on the entire kingdom that was the kingdom of Judah. And so it's not just that little space that's known as, that they've given the name Whydah to, almost as sort of a memorial. But that little space is not the kingdom itself. That's just simply something that's been retained by a conquering kingdom. And so they just simply retained that particular name for that space, but that is not the kingdom itself. And here we have this spelling of Whydah, and good old Wikipedia is providing all sorts of knowledge out there. And so one of the things that they provide is off to the right, you can see the different spellings, and they've noted that there's a basilica there, and up at the top, I know there was some discrepancy when there was some ground research being done in Whydah in Benin, and the individual tour guide, the individuals in Benin were not familiar with the fact that the name, the original place name for that space was Judah. And so that is the name of it. That's the original place name for that. And then in the Schomburg library facilities, you can also see some artwork regarding the nobles of the kingdom of Judah. Okay, now we're going to get down to business. All right, so we have Roi de Juda, and this is French. And so this is the painting that we have of Hefon, and we can see gone through the translations. And so this gets very interesting when you start to look at these translations between French and English and Yoruba and English. And some other languages here. So we have Roi de Juda. So basically this is the king of Judah, and Judah with the J-U-D-A-H is it's the spelling, it's the Hebrew spelling, and it's also the pre-exile spelling. And so it's the spelling of Judah, that kingdom prior to them being exiled. And so if you're looking at scripture and you're trying to figure out these different spellings, that's a part of that difference. And so after exile, the spelling of it, if you look in a concordance, the spelling of it, the H was taken off and it's just J-U-D-A. And so for all intents and purposes, there's no reason to believe that this is not this particular kingdom. Now, of course, this does not comport with what many people believe about who this ancestral group is supposed to be. But it is suggesting very heavily that the French thought this is who this was. They thought this was the king of Judah. The Portuguese thought this was the king of Judah. And we're going to find out who the Yoruba thought this was the king of. Well, based upon the look on Gary Coleman's face, it's very interesting who the Yoruba thought Hefan was and who the Yoruba thought the kingdom of Judah was. And so we're going to have to go through these translations from the Whydah to the Juda, and also the spelling that is the same spelling that is used by the Yoruba is used by the Kurdish. So this is very interesting in terms of all of these translations. And so we definitely have the French detected, this is the king of Judah. And in the Kurdish, the Juda is the that kingdom is God. And so you have the Kurdish into the Yoruba, and that is Olorun. And when you look on the screen, you can see that Olorun is God. And that is God with the big G, creator God. And so this translation is the king of God. And the kingdom of Juda is the kingdom of God. And this belief that was going across continents, apparently, about Hefan's identity and about the identity of that kingdom known as Judah, renamed Whydah, Juda, and Whydah, and all of these other names, it's quite clear that not only did the Yoruba understand that kingdom to be this kingdom of God and the king of Judah and the king of God, not only was that their understanding, but based upon the gifting of the crown and the throne and the scepter by the Stuart clan, the Stuart dynasty, and also the French and the Portuguese, there is every indication that that is who they understood this king to be also. And because of this, it brings up the question of what actually transpired when the kingdom was conquered. When it was conquered by Homey, when it was conquered by the Akan, what actually was going on. Some of it may have been ancestral fighting. However, given the sacrifice that also took place, there was also a religious component to this taking over of this kingdom and the massacre of those people. So in short, what you have is a situation not of simply participating in the slave trade, but this was an attempt at genocide and also an attempt at ethnic cleansing. The entire history has been pretty much wiped fairly clean in terms of the narrative for this particular kingdom, and it has been replaced, almost sort of a replacement dynamic. It has been replaced in large part by another kingdom and another kingdom's narrative, and also another kingdom's people. And so you have a kingdom taking over another kingdom, and then you have almost an assumption of another entity's identity. And so it's a very bizarre dynamic, but not a dynamic that is uncommon when kingdoms are taken over. And so, of course, many people would be wondering what happened to the 10 or 11,000 uh, individuals in that kingdom that were enslaved. And it's a very good question. Given Benin's connection, there was a connection to Portugal in particular, and then of course France. And there is some writing that shows that it's worded the dispersion. The dispersion was under the control or under the stewardship of the King of Saxony, and that was in 1789. And interestingly, that coincides with the not only the Haitian Revolution, you've got the French Revolution, you've got all of these wars of succession going on in the 1700s. You've got the Revolutionary War in America. You have all of these wars going on. You have the influx of, interestingly, about 10,000 people that were transferred into Louisiana during this exact same time. Now, there has been the statement that they were coming from Haiti. However, it is also possible that these individuals were transferred at that time also. And so that number 10,000, 11,000 seems to, be floating around there with a number of groups of people. Now, of course, you also have places like Martinique that might have had some influx from a French protectorate, if you will. Now, it's known that Benin made the first overture in terms of apologizing for the transatlantic slave trade, and notably both Ghana, which would translate to the Akan, Ghana and Benin have both made apologies with significant religious overtones, and those overtones have been very biblical overtones. And they have been related to this sort of metaphor of the group known as the Israelites. And so they have made references to that, particularly Ghana, on a number of occasions. And there's also been this Joseph Project and the year of return that's been discussed. Now, as with many individuals who understand themselves as descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, there is some confusion about exactly where their ancestors came from, if their ancestors were not already in the Americas as part of the indigenous population in the Americas. So there is some confusion about that. And I know some individuals are discussing a return to Africa. Given that people don't really have a clear sense of where they came from, where their ancestors might have come from in Africa, it would behoove most people to get a better understanding, a very clear understanding of where their ancestors came from. And so that means a lot of research prior to jumping, headlong into, another continent and attempting to claim that. Because if you don't know your ancestral narrative, it's possible to jump headlong into something that might not be in your best interest. And so without fully understanding where your ancestors came from, you might not fully understand your place in the new geographic space that you might be seeking to plant yourself into. And so there is enough in terms of, a little bit of confusion here in terms of Benin and Benin's role, or Homey's role in the transatlantic slave trade, and in the dynamics that might be going on even today between different groups that participated in the transatlantic slave trade and their current descendants. And so, to wrap this up, unless there is some other evidence to the contrary, it looks like this kingdom is the kingdom of Judah. and the understanding in terms of the labels that have been given to this kingdom. This kingdom has a religious identity, and not just a religious identity that's been given to it by some people in the West, but apparently people in Africa hundreds of years ago. That was the way that this kingdom was identified, not just in Africa, but also clearly also in Europe. And so as we wrap this up, want to point out a couple of things. This does not prove that any one person in the United States or any particular person in the West is a descendant of this particular kingdom. But what it does suggest is that these descendants should be somewhere. And there are some people with the Hophan's name, very few people, by the way, and that has been mentioned before. There are very few people, however, with that name, and I recognize that some of them went into exile. And so that's always an issue when a kingdom is taken over and the king and the family, when they're deposed. And so another reminder is that simply because one person has one ancestral narrative, they have a historical narrative about where they came from, how they came to be, it does not translate into the same narrative for the person that is next to you. And so some individuals feel very certain that they are a descendant of American chattel slavery. And it is their responsibility, however, to prove that. Because anyone could say simply because their skin is brown, they are a descendant of American chattel slavery. It doesn't necessarily make it so. Some brown-skinned people were descendants of American chattel slave owners. And so those of you who are doing your research, you need to, look at all of those options and all of those aspects of ancestry to make sure that you have it right. And also there needs to be a space for really respecting the historical narratives of other people. Not everyone who is brown came over on a ship. There were many people already in the United States, and there has been a significant attempt to rewrite their history. Okay, so it's the same dynamic going on. So there's been an attempt to rewrite their history. And so between Nordicism and Melanism, there have been all sorts of attempts to rewrite all sorts of histories. But it's very important that people pretty much stay in their own lane. When you know your ancestral narrative, hold on to that, but give other people space to locate and understand their own ancestral narrative. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.